Welcome in, folks. Here we go. We are ready to launch our fourth and final webinar series with the Niipaawi Strategies folks. And this has all been about creating space. And in this case, we're going to get into Indigenous business and government procurement. And it's an important conversation to have. It's going to get maybe a little weedy, and our intention is today to kind of wade through some of that. And let's talk about how Indigenous business, First Nations communities are getting involved in some of the procurement and projects that government are launching. So there's going to be two sides to this. How do they do that? And those of you who are looking for talent, services, etc., how can you take advantage of that? So we're going to talk a lot about that. There are a number of companies and governments that want to hire Indigenous vendors. How do you do that? How do you navigate that system? And it can be all well intended, but let's make sure that we provide some solutions on that very thing today, shall we? So my name's Dave Trafford. I'm here from Story Studio Network, and we're happy to include and invite Tabitha Bull is here. Tabitha is the president and CEO of the Canadian Council for Indigenous Business, and I already know Tabitha's got a thing or two to say about some of these procurement issues and how that's going to actually deal with and support Indigenous business across the country. Tanya Pash is here, President and CEO at Air Quebec. And this whole idea of, again, providing Inuit, First Nations, Indigenous-owned, Indigenous-led community businesses is going to be a critical part of this, and how they stand up vis-a-vis some of the procurement issues. And Jacob Taylor is here. He is a PhD executive director of the National Indigenous Economic Prosperity Institute, and I also know he's involved with some pretty cool stuff with aeronautics and drones and all kinds of cool technology. So I'm excited to get into the discussion with them. So thank you all for being here. And I think what we want to do is can we just start with this idea of the requirements of government contracts to have a 5% Indigenous procurement target. Tabitha, it sounds really kind of dry and technical, but this is where the conversation has to start. So two things. First, to what extent do the Indigenous businesses understand that target? And to a maybe lesser or more important, not sure, I'll get your perspective on it. To what extent do the non-Indigenous businesses fully appreciate and understand the opportunity there?
So it's not so much the 5% requirement in every contract, but it's a target to have a minimum of 5% across the board of dollars spent in the federal government. And prior to 2018, that requirement wasn't there. We had a lot of work to do to actually push government to put in a target, minimum requirement. And at that time, we were actually seeing corporate Canada much further ahead than the federal government on both targets and the actual spend that they were having with Indigenous businesses. And, you can really see the impact that has from looking, particularly for corporations who are working directly with Indigenous businesses in and around the projects that they have. So really affecting the communities. And we had corporate leaders come with us to Ottawa and talk to many ministers and ministries and procurement officers about the value, the experience, the just broad swath of Indigenous businesses that are in every sector and every size. We definitely ran into bias, full conversations saying that, there was a bias that Indigenous businesses were riskier or that they might cost more. And it really took those corporate partners that we have to dispel some of those myths from the government. And now that we have the target, there's still a lot of work to do, which I'm sure we'll get into, to ensure that Indigenous businesses are aware of that and to work with corporate Canada who are trying to meet the targets, maybe with a tier 2, tier 3 supplier if they're supplying to the government. But we are seeing it have a positive impact. And in talking to Indigenous businesses, they are saying that they've seen an increase in interest from large construction projects or defense projects from those ministries who are really putting a push on getting to their 5% target.
Okay, and I want to touch on about three or four things that you've put a pin in
Yeah.
already. So let's come back to that in a second. And I do want to get into that whole conversation around the Indigenous business certification process, because I think
Yeah.
that's an important part of this. How do we, navigate that? But Tanya, where does that all of this land in terms of the business that you do day to day? That this procurement target.
Well, it impacts the airline industry a little bit differently, but I do appreciate certain points and fully agree with Tabitha on certain points. For example, like sometimes native businesses are not always considered top-notch. Whereas Air Quebec, we're certified. We have a 705 operating certificate, which means we operate under the same guidelines as Air Canada, WestJet, Porter, all the major airlines. However, because it carries the name Cree, sometimes we're considered more of a bush airline. I think the perception that sometimes native businesses are not up to standards when we can far exceed certain standards, it's not always to take it into consideration. For us, we've also registered within Quebec and registered for government contracts. We do get called. We're on the same calling list. We don't have the same 5% for air traffic as much as we do, but we do get negotiated contracts within our own territory.
So, Jacob, speak to me about that. Bias is the only word that really applies here, because I note that your company has originative aerial is innovations, and you're putting it right out there. I mean, this is a First Nations owned and led organization, but somebody might look at that name and say, well, that's second class. Have you encountered that?
Well, I used to when I was a lot younger, but I've been fortunate enough throughout my career to, that my name exceeds my voice reach. And so people know now and have a trustworthiness with the brand, particularly in community, which is where the company is intended to service. And so it resonates with its stakeholders, its audience, its clients, and that's important. And, it's also important that I equally do not listen to the non-stakeholders, so other Indigenous folks who perhaps find it a challenge to even pronounce or say, or spell, whatever. It doesn't matter. And this week I was out interacting with some young people, the youth delegation of NACA, and they are like, that name is amazing, man. Really resonates home with us. And so that felt really good, of course, right? Um, and I think that's what it's, really important. And that stigma, to touch on that point that others mentioned and you touched on, I think comes from largely academic research. We can see across many different research paradigms that there is a deficit narrative about Indigenous people told, particularly in health data. It's my PhD background, academic background is health science, and a lot of the data again is deficit based when it came through the 80s, 90s, early 2000s, and so since the early 2000s and beyond, as we've had a good push of Indigenous people into the health sciences field, we're now on a strengths-based perspective with research, which is telling the good, and that's going on in community. And I see that academic lens from deficit to strength filtering out into the practical world, right? Into business, into politics. And so there is a strong role for researchers to play, Indigenous researchers to play in framing the strength-based narrative, and for all of our allies in research to use that strength-based narrative as well when discussing Indigenous people.
Well, and let me just come back to this, because Tabitha, you brought up the point that, for the most part, private sector was ahead of the thinking of government of the day. So are they still the drag on this? Is government just still too slow to sort of pick up on? Obviously, there's an understanding of value in the private sector generally in terms of what you're doing.
Yeah, I think, partially we're seeing in federal government, they've come out and said that they've exceeded their 5% target since they put that target in. There's still a lot of question marks around that, how they're measuring that, the audit part of that. But when we look across all levels of government, there are very few provincial organizations, municipal governments that have similar targets. And when we look at corporate Canada, there are a significant number of corporations who are focused on Indigenous procurement who have that within their strategy or their reconciliation action plan, and who are publicly reporting as well what their targets are and how they're meeting those. So we have at Canadian Council for Indigenous Business a procurement marketplace which has 1,700 certified Indigenous businesses in it, and 150 corporations who have publicly made a commitment to purchase from Indigenous business. And they're all definitely at different variations in that journey, but there are a significant number of them who are, exceeding 5% of their supply chain from Indigenous businesses.
Tanya, Jacob talked about sort of allowing his reputation to precede any of the misperceptions that might have come as a result of, the bias that's baked into some of this conversation. But, part of this is there's also this sense that when we have regulation like that and targets, we slip into the habit of ticking a box. And so how do you navigate that? How do you cut through that and say it's not just about a flipping box to tick here? We're not just criteria.
Well, exactly. We are not just criteria, and aviation, it's safety first, so we cannot be just a little box. We have to prove ourselves every day. We've been fortunate. We've got good relationship with multiple airlines, and we got good relationships with the local communities, not only Native, but also, Chamber of Commerce, mayors, town councils, who do support and promote us, and they assist us with the reputation that we, certain people may have been holding on to without actually knowing the true facts. So by building partnerships and putting our success stories forward, we are proud to say that, we are getting the confidence of many other reputable airlines. When I say reputable, we've met with major airlines within Quebec and Canada.
So, Tanya, what do you work harder at? Actually providing improved and superior service, or actually trying to make sure that you deal with those reputational misunderstandings?
It's a team effort. I've got a very good operational team, Transport Canada regulations, as well as the health and safety regulations of both provinces. It is safety first. I have myself flying as a single mother, and I have friends and family who are on multiple flights of ours, so safety will come first. But at the same time, by providing a quality service, I think that people realize that they're not, flying a Mickey Mouse operation. We're actually proving ourselves, and they are impressed. And I've had people come up to me and say, with a certain competitor, they would prefer to book Air Quebec just because they know that we provide an excellent service. We are customer focused and our operations are safe.
So, Jacob, when we talk about the, sort of making that breakthrough, at what point, or do you see in the course of your career, a point where the conversation we're having right now is going to be redundant? We're not going to need to have this conversation. Do you see a momentum behind that?
I really hope so. When I interact with elementary students, they see Indigenous inclusion as a no-brainer and as something exciting that brings, cultural richness to projects. And for some reason, as we get into older populations, that becomes less and less. So for sure, I see in the future young people embracing this even more. And I'm so proud of the young Indigenous people who are standing on their own 2 feet with their braids hanging down from their hair and still speaking that, from that two-eyed approach, integrating their culture, but also competent and knowledgeable in the Western world or the Canadian society's ways. And then I also, again, commend non-Indigenous young people who make space for that and see that as, again, something exciting, something that they want to have included. It's not a have to do, it's a want to do. And so I think the future of Canada is very exciting for those young people, and it's on the trailblazers. And while Tabitha, Tanya, and myself had many people who blazed a trail before us, just to keep making, to keep walking it, keep tamping down that ground so that it's a really solid path to walk into the future and very easy for more people to join it. Yeah.
Well, and the last time you and I talked, we talked in the context of the forestry sector and the work that you were doing in that respect. And the program we were working on was called Canadian Forestry Can Save the World. And as you and I were talking, we got into this conversation of the value and the importance of this indigenous view, 7 generations forward, 7 generations back. That's what informs how we live, how we do business, how we connect with other people, how we connect with the earth. And I quipped at the time, I said, that ancient traditional thinking in many ways is now being all excited about, well, look at the new science. And so there is, as glib as that might sound, there is something of a breakthrough there when we're seeing that being embraced in new technology, new science, new environmental approaches, new issues around climate risk.
That's right. And a lot of the academic language now is like transdisciplinary with that, so many different perspectives included. And I sometimes tease, as you were just saying, like it's old wisdom from Indigenous thinking, like that's our clan systems at work, all these different people with different responsibilities and knowledge bases ultimately functioning together as a whole. And so, just always kudos to our Indigenous ancestors and the knowledge they had. It was actually very forward thinking and very past thinking, as you mentioned. And we did discuss 7-generation thinking. And I believe I mentioned to you, Dave, that, for me, I think of myself as the 4th generation. So I think back to the first, which is like my great grandfather, and I think forward to my great grandchildren. And it's really living to me, not so much 140 years back and 140 years forward, but more just like 70 years in each direction of my life. And then it's much more tangible for me, to forecast the future and to understand the history.
So in that context, Tabitha, let's go back to, that whole issue of how do we, certify or qualify what is an Indigenous business, because it's not necessarily, based on what Jacob just said, it's not necessarily about one end of the spectrum or the other. It's where you are on that spectrum, isn't it?
Yeah, there's so many variations of business, like there are, in Indigenous economies, like any other economy. And when we look at, how do you certify an Indigenous business, when we get now to this real push that's so important on the 5%, and all of the media news that we've seen on the Indigenous procurement of late, I think it's become a bit of a political football federally, or at least it was before the election. And that, that's unfortunate because there is so much good that can come from Indigenous procurement. And it, at the federal level, for sure, there is improvement that is needed and audits that's needed to ensure that Indigenous businesses are actually an Indigenous owned and controlled business. But I think we also have to look at how are we helping to support building capacity within a business, within a community, from a perspective of ownership and control. So there's some individuals who, in order to protect against people who might be taking advantage of the system, want to put up more stringent guardrails on what an Indigenous business is. So, as an example, that business has to ensure that the owner has the ability or skills to run the business. And in my perspective, that's going to really limit the number of Indigenous businesses that we have. And how are we then building capacity with an Indigenous community or in an Indigenous business? And how are we really building those bridges that we are going to need as a country to move forward? So, I think in any system, any opportunity, people are going to take advantage. And we have to ensure that we're continuing to push for Indigenous procurement, improving the system without providing additional scrutiny or barriers to Indigenous businesses that they already face. There used to be a requirement that for an Indigenous business to be certified with the government, you had to have 33% of your staff be Indigenous people. And that's an additional requirement that an Indigenous business has that, if you're doing a women-owned business or a Black-owned business, they don't have that requirement. So we just have to be really careful that policies don't create additional barriers when we know Indigenous businesses already face them.
So and I'm going to be kind and suggest that those requirements are based in good intention. I mean, and there is some level of, we want to make sure that, to your point, there's some protection baked in, but there's a certain patronizing quality to that as well, to be, at the same time. And that doesn't play well for a lot of reasons in the Indigenous communities.
Yeah, I mean, so that requirement of 33% is no longer there. And part of that was, as CCIB, we went through the process to be certified with the federal government as a entity, a not-for-profit Indigenous entity. And me having to go to my staff and ask them for their status card or their Métis card or Inuit card it was gross. I don't know how a better word.
Yeah. Good word.
And then I have to provide those status cards back to Indigenous Services Canada, who's the organization who actually provides out those status cards. So, going through that process ourselves and relaying that story to the minister, who was Minister Miller at the time, and saying this is a very patriarchal process that you're requiring Indigenous businesses to go through. But it also then limits, good business. So good business, if I'm going to acquire a new company or go through a merger, it's good business to bring on the skill set in that business that I'm acquiring. And if that's a non-Indigenous person, it's a good business for me to bring that person over as I build up the business and that person has the capacity and relationships. But that requirement would mean I would have to take over that business and hire all new people. I mean, that doesn't make good business sense. So I think there's, barriers, good intention, because I think the intention was ensuring that businesses were employing Indigenous people, that benefit was going back to the community. But, as Jacob, says, that's within our core values. We already know that Indigenous businesses hire more Indigenous people, that they are sustainable at their core, that they give back to community. Those are things that, are rooted in our value systems, and we don't need government requirements to ensure that we're doing that.
Yeah, Tanya, I've had conversations lately with members of the Inuit community in Nunavut. We're doing a show specifically about the Arctic. But what I find remarkable is that is the guiding principle of, the people of the Nunavumia. That is to say, we are here to support each other. We are here first to be of community. We are here first to make sure all the boats rise, to make sure we're all safe and well taken care of. And it's in a strange way in the corporate world, Western corporate world, that's not where we start the conversation all the time.
No, it's not. And if you look at our culture and our history, survival meant that you worked together. You included everybody. If somebody had a big kill, they would share it with the rest of the camp and other neighboring camps. So to support each other, it's always been there, naturally ingrained in our DNA. And then when you're talking about the Aboriginal Procurement Program, where there are certain guidelines, and I do agree that there has to be a certain level of guidelines. But what I find is the most important one is not always adhered to, which is the benefit to the nation or the community or the reserve, that, bringing it back to the people. What I've seen in my experience is that there's some front, shall we call it that, who passes a native organization, and the money goes out to a company somewhere else that does not benefit the people. So, I think it has to be a mixture. I agree that sometimes they're a fixed number of percentage of employees, that might be a little bit hard, because naturally we are going to hire our local people because we don't have to transport them. So I think really going forward, I think if we were to have a good communication and a gaps analysis, if we're not getting the contract, can we understand what we're missing and why? Why did you award it to company A and not company B? I think that would go a long way, as well as the communication and the broadcasting. We do have these subsidies available and these contracts available. There are a lot of young entrepreneurs that maybe have no idea that they can even access some funds. So, I thank you for this show, because I think it's going to be a key point for them.
Yeah, and I want to get into that in a minute, just so that we can kind of, deal with that in terms of the practical application of where the benefits are, because I don't want to get hung up on what the problems are. Again, I come at this from the perspective that whatever the regulation may have been we got to hope that it was based in good intention. So if you're just joining us, this is the Indigenous business and government procurement as an element of creating space. With our friends at Niipaawi Strategies, Tabitha Bull is here, Tanya Pash, and Jacob Taylor. Jacob, I want to pick up on this idea of, creating criteria in terms of definition of what is an Indigenous business. And I keep hearing from time to time, often now, the importance of that is less in terms of a head count, but how do we create capacity within the community so that we do have the skills that Tabitha described within the First Nations and Indigenous communities, where you can go out and hire somebody and say, this is great because they live in whatever community you're in. They are contributing to the First Nations community because they are in that community. But we need to build the capacity, right?
Yeah, we absolutely need to build capacity. I mean, I think the early national efforts of our people was all around education, right? And wanting to have higher education opportunities for our people, more equitable opportunities in those higher education spheres, but also really good education all the way down to early childhood. And, over the years, we're seeing that every treaty has the responsibility for the government to provide that education. But, the statistics are that it's 65% of funding of the actual need. So there's always been a constant deficiency. Canada's only Indigenous university, recognized by Universities Canada, First Nation University of Canada in Saskatchewan, has had the same funding levels for the last 20 years. The student population is burgeoning. So when we talk about capacity and, needing this, we all recognize it, but how is there a lot of follow through in our society wide to uplift our people, in that way? And what the way we want to get to, right, is the senior leadership, the control that Tabitha was indicating. We're all on the board, but perhaps all different diverse Canadians are working within the company. And why does that matter? Well, because that company controlled by us is putting our values forward. So we're not just focused on profit as the bottom line. We also are helping with, the people nearby and the land nearby and the water nearby and the air nearby, things that are inherently connected to us. So, the capacity needs to be built, but built for the highest levels. Historically, we've seen, capacity impact with mines, and perhaps community has the cleaning of the man camp jobs, or whatever, not the influential decision making. And so as we're looking at capacity, it's this really high level executive C-suite capacity that I really want to see built out.
Well, Tabitha, to that point, I've heard the phrase lately: if you're not at the table, you're on the menu, and that's the real conversation to have here. Is that in fact it's not about, and again, it's not about being invited to the table. It's about you being at the table, and to Jacob's point, we have the say of what is on the menu, so to speak, and to be able to have that conversation actively is important, and I think that gets lost in this conversation a little bit.
Yeah, I think maybe I'll just touch on one other thing. That capacity goes both ways too, right? So there's so much that an organization can learn from having an Indigenous partner, and so many benefits that can come to a project as well, from the capacity, particularly of like the territory, the medicines that are there in that area that the project, if we're talking about an infrastructure project, might happen. By having an Indigenous partner or the community as an owner, like an equity owner in that project, you're able to, environmental assessments are able to be done in a much more fair way. The responsibility about sustainability of that project, because those community people are going to be there for 7 generations. That's their territory. And if we look at reclamation from a mining project as well, we have much more success when the community is an equity partner in that project. And we're having a lot of these conversations right now with investors, trying to attract investment into infrastructure projects, and explaining to them the benefit of having an Indigenous equity partner in that project in certainty around investment. And part of that is also that capacity building that can happen with corporate Canada who might currently be looking at profit first, but them really understanding the benefit of sustainability and governance and all of these conversations that happen around ESG. I think we Indigenous communities and businesses were having them long before that was a popular acronym, I would say. Yeah, so I wanted to touch on that. There's things that we can bring to the table that are of such value that I think corporate Canada and investors are really starting to understand. And as we look to at the young people that are coming up and value those things more, perhaps. And
well, to the point where but that acronym has actually been expanded to ESGI, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm hearing that the Indigenous component of it is now becoming part of the lexicon. Based on what you're talking about.
I more agree with Tabitha that ESG equals I, or I equal.
There you go. Yeah.
ESG a long time ago.
Yeah, and I think at the boardroom table, that's something we've been really pushing on also about, ensuring that we are building leaders and space for Indigenous people to sit at boardroom tables, to be part of that decision making, not just within their own organizations, but everybody on the stock exchange and private companies as well. We're definitely seeing an increase in that, but it's a pretty small number still. I think in the last public reporting of public boards, it was about 10 boards that had Indigenous people, and some of those are the same person sitting on more than one. So we have some work to do there.
And I want to come back to sort of what you see, the three of you see as sort of a path to actually, unlocking the procurement opportunities here for both Indigenous, non-Indigenous. But, it's been alluded to already, Tanya, that we have a government in Ottawa that was slow to pick up on. I mean, all due respect to, Minister Miller. I mean, that's a pretty recent issue in terms of saying you had to have that many Indigenous members on your staff. So it's not very long ago that happened. And again, the idea that private sector is steps ahead of where the private the public regulators are and so on. But we're at a stage in our history now where the Prime Minister was in Washington this past week, and among the three top things that he talked about was, the Arctic and sovereignty and the need to invest in those communities, big transformational infrastructure that's going to happen. Are we at an opportunity here where we don't want to waste a good crisis?
Yeah, I guess a good crisis. I like that. No, but I think yes, we are. Every opportunity that you get to move forward and building bridges, it makes sense, because if you're working with somebody, then you're expanding your pool of knowledge, you're expanding your resource pool, you're expanding your HR pool. It would be phenomenal. And one of the things that we always said is, if we have with so many First Nations communities and Inuit communities across Canada, if you were to build a relationship with just one of them a year, you would have business for over 600 years, because there's so many out there. And I fully agree that there's things to be learned and different strategies to be learned from both parties. Capacity building does work both ways. And I think the ESG or ESGI would be our teaching towards other non-native communities. Because we've always, at Air Quebec, we've always had the mandate where, yes, we have to be self-sufficient financially, but we also, within our incentive plan, we have the social mandate that we have to consider, which corporate Canada does not have that.
Well, in a strange way, Jacob, we're talking about the Indigenous community or the Indigenous businesses actually having a larger tent, and where you are able to invite the non-Indigenous in, because there is value to be in there.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to touch on that, cross-border statements from earlier, it's we didn't make that line. We've always labeled it a medicine line, that we've seen it preventing us from accessing the things we needed for healing and well-being. And we've always seen the value in alliance and relationship with our kin to the south of us, across the Americas and across the Pacific Islands. We all have a common belief system, cosmology, a relationship with the world. as well as historical battle with colonization. So we have always had many reasons for unity among Indigenous people, globally, really, but especially here on Turtle Island. And we have this craving to get back to that. We see with like J Treaty status wanting to be implemented better, and we really do need more capacity, as Tabitha was saying, on the other side to understand those rights and privileges that we have and the net benefits that brings to all of us. It's not a have and have not. This is truly Indigenous prosperity is all of our prosperity.
Tanya, we throw around the phrase here that you suffer sometimes from the curse of knowledge, and that is to say that you don't fully appreciate the value of the knowledge that you have, and that is to say it out loud more often. And I wondered to what extent Indigenous communities, to some degree, suffer from that curse of knowledge, and don't they're not they don't articulate it loudly enough. They don't raise their voices loudly enough so that we can say, oh, you're over there, it's a noisy place anyway. And then we get to Jacob's point where we can begin to say, okay, I'm starting to make the connections here, but they've got to say it out loud.
Yeah, I think sometimes we do hold ourselves back in a sense that, traditionally, we're more humble. We don't like to brag because we've always had that community aspect of living. So like, you didn't want one person to stand out more. So now when we're heading out into there's ease of transportation, ease of communication, it's just naturally ingrained in you not to be seen as a braggart. But we do have a lot to be proud of, and we are encouraging people to talk about the success stories. So we talk about it amongst ourselves mostly, but we're not necessarily going out into the rest and beyond our borders to say this is what we can do, because a lot of people are truly impressive, and they're our best kept secret sometimes.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, we're hoping that this conversation generally is a door opener for some of that. So, let's go back to the original issue here around procurement then. And if we look at, how do we apply that say it out loud posture, Tabitha, to the procurement side of things on both sides of it, whether it's the Indigenous businesses that would take full advantage of it. And quite frankly, as soon as you say to me, well, it's great, you can get procurement, you're going to have to fill out the RFP, and all my eyes roll in the back of my head. It's all I hear is paperwork and stats and all kinds of nonsense that's going to have to go into it. You got to get past that to actually get to the opportunity. So how are you helping people navigate that system?
Yeah, so a few ways. One, the marketplace that I talked about, where that's an opportunity for businesses to be able to post any type of opportunities that they have. But another requirement that we have from organizations is that they have to identify an individual who is focused on Indigenous procurement. Because navigating through a large corporation and finding that one person in procurement, even when you work within those organizations, is very difficult. So that's a key piece of the requirement. We also require that all of those businesses have an Indigenous procurement policy, not a supplier diversity policy, but an Indigenous procurement policy. And we really make that as a distinction. And we're pushing for that distinction.
Define that distinction. Define that distinction for me, because I think it's important.
Yes, it is. And it's there's a lot of work happening on supplier diversity that we support fully and support, Black-owned businesses, women-owned businesses, underrepresented businesses. But Indigenous people in Canada have constitutional rights. And it is our belief that every Canadian and every corporation has a responsibility to help support building Indigenous economies, because every Canadian, every corporation has benefited from us not being in the economy in the past, from the purposeful exclusion of us from the economy. And it's very important that we ensure that Indigenous procurement is seen differently, is worked on differently, is not put into a larger group of supplier diversity procurement. And I think this is going to become very important as we see conversations in the US moving away from supplier diversity. And if those same corporations operate in Canada, we are being very mindful and reminding them that Indigenous procurement is very different. Even in the U.S. now, the new administration has removed their supplier diversity, and that has impacted a number of Native-owned businesses who had direct contracts with the federal government. So it's very important that we're ensuring that Canadians, corporations, all levels of government are very aware that Indigenous procurement is part of their work on reconciliation.
Tanya, there are no shortage, I'm discovering, there are no shortage of young entrepreneurs who are right out of school. Maybe they're self-taught, all that sort of, they're in their 20s and they're eager and they're excited about what it is they do. And in many cases, they are picking up on what Jacob talked about in terms of that generational knowledge of their territory. And so they're driven by a connection to the environment and the climate risks and so on. And there's no shortage of passion there, but they need to get where Tabitha's talking about. So if someone were to come to you and say, I'm a 26-year-old who's working in this environment and I'm a solopreneur and I want to make sure that I'm making all the difference in the world, what do you tell her?
I say it's not going to be easy, but anything worth having is worth going after. There's going to be a lot of research that you can have, and you're going to have a lot of challenges going forward, but that's true of anything that you want. There are programs that you can access, and you have to have the knowledge, you have to have the skill, you have to have the market, but most important of all of that, and what you've demonstrated, is you have the willpower and the drive. So make the contacts, find out what your needs are, what the market wants, and just build your business case from there and move forward. Start small, but keep on moving forward no matter what.
Well, and to the extent we talked about capacity, we talked about bridge building, we've talked about taking advantage of the network, and in previous programming, Jacob, we talked about the importance of education and mentorship. I don't think you can understate how important the mentorship, the role model, is in all of this. And if anybody's going to make a change or an impact in the procurement process, it's not the people in this room. It's going to be like my granddaughter's age, right? I mean, these are the kids that are going to come up, go through education, and live in an environment where it's going to be obvious, this conversation. It's not going to be something new to them. So that role model element and setting the tone, I think, is really the importance of leadership right now, no?
Yeah, for sure. People need folks to look up to. I always think of that guy breaking the 3-minute mile, right? After it was impossible, and one person does it, then there's 10 people. Now it's a very common occurrence. Things grow like that in a social context. The power of social capital is huge. For me, even like my native grandfather was an entrepreneur. My father was an entrepreneur. I'm an entrepreneur. It grows like that. And so, I want to encourage people to, take those scary steps that Tanya described, because you're taking them for all of us. While it feels like you're alone, in our collective mindset, we're all watching, and your win is our win. And to that end, further, role models need to constantly be making time. I'm, so impressed with people like Don Madabi, the chairwoman of the National Indigenous Economic Development Board, or like President Jacqueline Ottman of the First Nation University of Canada. You see those women out in community at regular events like powwows and stuff, and that way young people see that, have a chance to interact with that, and be that. And so I just think that's so wonderful. And so I want to encourage so many more people to take that role modelship on. I know it's you got to overcome some shyness with it, but it is so crucial that people see themselves represented, see that they can make it, and that's the work that we're all doing together. Yeah.
So Tabitha, if you've got guidance for any of the young entrepreneurs who are doing this, and is there what direction would you give them, first in terms of good advice, but second in terms of support from your organization?
Yeah, so what we know that access to capital is the biggest barrier still for Indigenous entrepreneurs, but to Jacob's point, social capital is so important as well. I think about like my two boys. I live currently in Tuckerano in Toronto, and just the social circles that my boys are able to be in is a huge opportunity for them if they wanted to start a business. So really to take advantage of those type of opportunities of, going to events, your Chamber of Commerce, if, to going to Indigenous business events, taking advantage of those opportunities to make those connections. And we have a number of events across the country, which that is the sole purpose of those events. And then, I think there is a real opportunity and appetite for change and for progress, both in corporate Canada, in government. Us being the changes that we've made in the last 6 years in advocating for the target of 5%, for reporting on the 5%. Like, there is an appetite for change there. So if there is a barrier that an entrepreneur comes up against, I really encourage them to reach out to us, to many others who are advocating for this work, because we need to know what those issues are so we can push to get them changed. But we are in a moment of appetite, of openness for change and progress.
And I dare say you'd be open and welcome to hear anybody who's had a good opportunity and a solution to some of these problems, because you can spread that around just as quickly as you can the good advice based on your own experience. So
yes, definitely.
Don't want to miss that opportunity.
No,
Tabitha Bull. Indeed. Tabitha Bull, Tanya Pash, and Jacob Taylor, this has been a great conversation. Thank you for giving us your time and your insights and your guidance on this story. And again, if the whole issue, again, sounds a little weedy around procurement and government procurement, but it's an important conversation to have. And to Tabitha's point, there is an appetite for change. But again, just remember, if you've just been joining us in the last hour on this live stream, this is a relatively new function at government, right? That in fact, if you can push it forward, push the ball up the hill, I always say it's the least I can do, because, well, I like doing the least I can do. But that small thing that you might want to do is the kind of thing that makes a difference. So, thanks to you all for being here. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. So, yes, another fascinating conversation. We've had a ball doing this with our team at Story Studio Network, and all part of the Creating Spaces. And there are 4 editions. If you have missed them, this is the first one you've dropped in on, and you can check them all out on YouTube. But by the way, we'll also have audio podcast versions of this show. So if you're anything like me, you've learned a whole lot over the course of this. And I think maybe inspired a little bit in terms of just national self-awareness in terms of what it is we can contribute to, and some of the opportunities that are here. I know I only joke and say, we take advantage of a good crisis. There are great opportunities here for economic growth at really important regions, important parts of this world, and particularly in Indigenous communities. But you know what? From Baker Lake in Nunavut to Bay Street in Toronto, there are connections there all the way along. And we would be remiss if we ignored them. And in fact, we would be sort of hurting ourselves economically if we ignore them. So none of this happens without our friends at Niipaawi Strategies. And they have done all the heavy lifting, bringing this all together to talk about the path forward in Indigenous innovation in Canadian high-tech sector. So let's throw it over to Cam, and he's got some final words for us.
I'm Cam Holmstrom, founder and principal of Niipaawi Strategies. Thank you so much to our incredible panelists for today's Creating Space event. I think I can speak for all of us that we have gained so much insight into procurement and more in today's conversation. We're grateful for their time and expertise and their willingness to share with us today. Our goal when we set out to create these events was not to talk about the problems that exist, but to discuss ideas and solutions that help move the needle forward for everyone. I really feel that we have achieved that and more. Thank you as well to all of our panelists over the entire series. The conversations and knowledge shared by our guests over the past 4 events has been eye-opening and has provided a lot of excitement and hope for Indigenous businesses and entrepreneurs in the high-tech sector across Canada. As Josh Nilsson of Masco Investments said during our first event, walk through every door like your ancestor opened it for you. We hope this series helps to open those doors. We have loved these conversations so much, we want to make them widely available for listening by using them as the foundation for our upcoming podcast, Roots of Change, Indigenous Innovation, Reshaping Industry and Reconciliation. You'll find it wherever you listen to podcasts, and you can look for the trailer to drop on June 3rd. All episodes will go live on June 17th. Let's keep these conversations going. Merci, miigwech, merci, and thank you for your support in this series. Now we send it back to Dave to wrap up today's event.
Thank you, Cam. Yeah, and in fact, I think it's an important part of this discussion to suggest perhaps, over the summer when the podcasts are available and you're doing your road trips because you're doing your all in Made in Canada, elbows up tourism this year. These are conversations that might be worthy of the road trip with the teenagers in the car when you're driving around in Canada. And when you drive through regions of Canada where, there are First Nations doing business and so on, and it just a level of awareness. But we want to kind of get down to it's the roots of change. So what better place to start than with the kids and the youth in our lives? So if you have that opportunity, let's do that, shall we? So listen, it's been a pleasure. I'm thrilled that we've had the opportunity to be involved and engaged in this conversation. Again, thanks to Dan and Cam at Niipaawi. Thanks to the production team at SSN. And by the way, make sure that you flip on the QR code here. It'll come up and it'll take you directly to more information from Niipaawi Strategies. I'm Dave Trafford. Thanks for joining us from Story Studio Network.